So if you watched a recent video I made, you'll know that currently I'm working on a new pitch series discussing what would happen if the BBC handed me the keys to the TARDIS and gave me a shot at being the new showrunner for Doctor Who. And in this video, I'm here to follow up with the second part of this series, where I break down the next chapter of the story where the Doctor, Chameleon and Charlie face off against the dreaded Cybermen in a future where they're at war with the remnants of humanity. Now, before we can get into Season 2, we need to first recap Season 1 and the major events for those just joining in. Season 1 introduces us to the landscape of 2049, a technological haven thanks to the efforts of Arthur Tressman and the Hexagon Corporation. We introduced a new companion in Nathalie Emmanuel as Charlie Edwards and paired her with Andrew Lincoln as the 16th Doctor, as the two of them faced off against Toby Alexander Smith as the Master. With the Master himself locked up in Unit Tau by the finale and no longer considered an active threat, Charlie has now joined the Doctor and Chameleon as his new TARDIS team, and they explore the wider reaches of the universe and see what it has in store for them. So, with the Master being the villain for Season 1 and him being sort of incapacitated by the finale, who's the villain for Season 2? Well, that's a very good question that I'm sure some of you may have picked up if you stayed for the tease at the end of Season 1. The story for Season 2 will see the Doctor and Charlie getting involved in the final days of the Cyber Wars, which of course means our villains will be the Cybermen. So for those who don't know, the Cyber Wars was one of the many galactic conflicts from the wider Whoniverse that we haven't really seen fully play out on screen. Whilst we have seen events after it, like with Ascension of the Cybermen, think of it like the Time War or the Sontaran Rutan War, where you've heard all these things about the conflict, but never have we fully seen it play out on screen. Though in the case of the Time War we do have Big Finish, and I think we're getting that with the Sontaran/Rutan War. That might have happened already, I don't know. But the Cyber Wars have not had that luxury, at least not yet. Now, using the Cybermen for Season 2 is going to be different than what we've seen before, as I'm going to be utilising a few different variants of the villains. The first variant that is more predominantly seen throughout the story will be the Lumic/Cyber Cybermen from Modern Who, and sadly were replaced by the Nightmare and Silver design during Series 7 and the Ascension/Cybermaster designs in Series 12. The second type of Cybermen I will be using is the Cyber Commander. Now, for those who don't know, the Cyber Commander is a design that we've never actually seen before in the Whoniverse in live action, and that's because the plans to use it initially were scrapped completely. The Cyber Commander design was planned to be used in the 90s as part of a direct-to-video movie to celebrate Doctor Who's, at the time, 30th anniversary in 1993. It would have featured Doctors 3 through 7 alongside a few companions taking on a villain made of chronal energy, and explores an alternate timeline where the Fourth Doctor himself never died from the Faros project in Legopolis, leading to the erasure of all his future incarnations. And finally, the last type of Cyberman is actually a new one I've made specifically for this series. These Cybermen are zombified humans, and the story behind them is that the conversion process, during it, the emotional inhibitors weren't installed properly and turned the resulting subjects of the conversion into almost zombified and mindless creatures. Moving on to some character details now, we'll start with the Doctor, as there are quite a few developments with his character in this season that I would like to fully discuss. When he and Charlie land on Earth during the conflict, the Doctor works with the main leader of this group, who actually turns out to be a descendant of the Brigadier and Kate Stewart. Eventually, however, a Cyberman attack results in the death of the Brigadier's descendant and leaves this resistance now without a leader. In the aftermath, the Doctor rallies together the remaining members of the Resistance and has no choice but to embrace a role that he once held in contempt for a very long time. It's time for him to become the Doctor of War once again. The third episode of this series for me is where we see the Doctor at his best, I think, determined to make it off this abandoned cyber carrier before the zombified Cybermen can convert him and Charlie into these undead monsters. However, this experience, combined with who he becomes during this conflict, leads to Charlie not wanting to travel with the Doctor anymore, and she leaves him for good. This season is what sets up the Doctor's next arc going into Season 3, and that's how far he's willing to go to save the world from a catastrophic threat. That then brings us to Charlie, who we met in Season 1 and joined the Doctor aboard the TARDIS alongside Chameleon. Now, as mentioned, this season will see Charlie depart the TARDIS for a few reasons. The first one being, it's the overall impact of the cyber wars and seeing what this kind of conflict does to people. The second reason is that she sees what kind of impact this conflict specifically has on the Doctor, and while she doesn't know what kind of impact the Time War had because her time period is in a quote-unquote post-war future from the Doctor's perspective, the events of this series for her gets to the point where she says enough is enough and she leaves on fairly bad terms with the Doctor. And that in of itself is actually very rare, because whilst we've seen companions depart on either good terms with the Doctor or they left unwillingly, we've never, to my knowledge at least, seen a long-term companion of the Doctor leave the TARDIS on bad terms in any way. I don't really count Adam Mitchell in that for obvious reasons, since he was only in 2 stories on screen. And in this case we're only sticking to the TV series. Expanded media is a whole other can of worms. But a companion departing on bad terms is something that I always got curious about, and it's something I wanted to try and incorporate into my take on the show in some way. Now I'm going to very quickly go into some new characters and who will be playing them in this season. The first one of course is the descendant of the Brigadier, Lieutenant Thomas Alderman Lethbridge Stewart. Thomas grew up hearing stories of the Doctor from the Unit archives and is honoured to be meeting the very legend himself. We've seen the Doctor have a relationship with Unit in many forms over the years, but I've always wondered what that would look like at this point in time. And whilst Kate and the modern version of Unit will be appearing a bit further down the line, I wanted to explore the far future for a bit before we take things a little more grounded with seasons 3 and 4, but I will of course save those stories for their respective videos. Regarding whom could play this descendant of the Brigadier in the story, I didn't initially think about using Max Bowden because he can pull off a moustache, though I've used him before in season 1 as Tamora Lawton, so for that I would want an unknown actor of some variety perhaps to take on the role. The second companion is sort of a temporary one for this season, Ezekiel Shaw. Now Ezekiel is a character that's had roots in my Doctor Who work for a while now. Although not seen on the channel, a while ago I was working on a project called Doctor Who Concepts, which would have paired Doctors with companions facing off against a master, with each one having a different subgenre of sci-fi to it. The first story, which became the proof of concept for my Doctor Who reboot, was initially conceived as a quote-unquote cyberpunk story, as we see the Doctor regenerate and then meeting Charlie, and it's also worth noting that each story would have had an Elseworlds quality to it. So the Lincoln Doctor would have followed an alternate timeline established from the Time War, where instead of fleeing the war and turning himself human, the Master actually worked with the Doctor in an effort to try and end the war himself. Anyway, Ezekiel in this season will be portrayed by Lenny James, perhaps known for a lot of things including his work in Line of Duty, Snatch, or of course The Walking Dead and its spin-off Fear the Walking Dead. Lenny for me possesses a lot of the qualities I would want the actor to play Ezekiel, and it's why I've cast him in this story, more or less. And now moving on to the overall outline for the season and its episodes. If you want to see a more detailed breakdown, then you can head to the Google document in the description below, where you'll find a lot more information on the story overall. So episode 1 is the introduction to the landscape that we'll be focusing on. We briefly recap the events of season 1 before catching up with the Doctor and Charlie in the present day of the story. This takes us into the rest of the episode, where the Doctor and Charlie herself land in one of the many battlefields of the Cyber Wars, and after the death of the Resistance leader, the Doctor is forced to embrace his role as the Doctor of War once again. Episode 2 then drops us further into the conflict and introduces us to Ezekiel Shaw, who becomes something of a confidant for the Doctor, quite appropriate considering he's a vicar. We see the Doctor confide in Ezekiel about the Time War and the choices he was forced to make during that difficult period in his life. Charlie gets a subplot in this episode where she discovers blueprints for the Cyber Commander and delivers them to the Resistance, and the episode ending with the discovery of an abandoned cyber ship on the edge of the galaxy. Episode 3 follows up on that ending, as we see the Doctor and Charlie land on that ship with the TARDIS and Chameleon, discovering the horrifying truth about the members of the crew on board. The episode is similar to Wild Blue Yonder, except the shapeshifters have been replaced by zombified Cybermen, and there's more than 2 of them. Episode 4 would take us back to the battlefield as the Doctor and Charlie return, scarred from the events of the previous episode. This would see the official debut of the Cyber Commander, a more skeletal variant of the basic Cyberman design, containing blades in its arms as opposed to a laser cannon. The end of the episode would see the discovery of the Cyber Controller, who's been controlling this group of Cybermen during the series thus far. Episode 5, the penultimate episode, would bring us the reveal of this entire group of Cybermen being connected by a hive mind, which in turn is connected to the Cyber Controller. The episode itself ends with the Resistance and the Doctor discovering the new weapon that the Cybermen have been constructing, a deadly nuclear device with the intent of using it to wipe out the remainder of humanity on Earth. And that of course brings us to the finale of the series, not only with the defeat of the Cybermen and the sacrifice of Ezekiel, but also the departure of Charlie from the TARDIS, as she can no longer watch the Doctor go down the path he's allowed himself to follow. We end the finale and this season of the show on the shot of the Doctor looking in the mirror as she wonders How far will he go to protect the universe? And that concludes Season 2 of my take on Doctor Who. This was genuinely a joy to put together, and I hope you enjoyed it. And next season we're headed to Atlantis as the Doctor also journeys to the 80s and finds a new companion. But in the meantime, be sure to like and subscribe, as well as keeping an eye out for future entries in the series. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you very soon.